When we started the book of Ecclesiastes, we looked at this outline, which kind of centered in on the first 6 chapters, really. As you notice, the vanity of all things earthly, and pointed out the vanity of life, wisdom, pleasure, earthly wisdom and folly. There's an interlude, and then you have the labor being dealt with, then an interlude of reverent fear, and then earthly wealth and honor. And each one of those pointing out that it never gave the, I guess you would say, purpose, the true meaning and a sense of accomplishment that it promised. Instead, it was something that came up short. And then we had noticed that we next would have these statements of words of wisdom. And that's where we're going to take up tonight in just a second. When you look at Hebrew poetry, it always has a balance in it. Any kind of poetry does, but Hebrew especially is intended to have the kind of a balance of here's the cause and here's the effect. More often, here is the one thing that's like this other thing, a comparative. There's a contrasting that you'll find in the phrases that are there. That kind of a balance is what's being done here in this book, not only in form, but in substance as well. That you look at life and you recognize that it's not all about one thing or another, that there is a balance. And that instead of having, if I just have more of this, then everything will be all right, that's not necessarily so. There needs to be 2 different ones that would help me to have a better way of life. And that's one of the things that's pointed out as you start out in the vanity there. But now as you go into the words of wisdom, what's good for man to do on the earth, you notice that same kind of thing. There's words of wisdom in view of man's wickedness. We need to understand that that is there, that men are not all good, that there are ones who are there who are living in a way of wickedness, indeed some that are given almost entirely to that, as the writer points out. The words of wisdom in view of God's providence in life. Some call it the inscrutable providence that is there. That God's ways cannot be found out. That His ways are ones that though we look at them and may think we know something, that isn't necessarily so because of His greater wisdom and so forth. The words of wisdom in view of the uncertainties of life. Not everything is as you would expect it. What seems to be so of someone prepared for a certain thing may not be the one who's able to overcome that thing, even though prepared, and one who looks unprepared may be able to overcome it. When you look at the words of wisdom regarding the aging process in life, there is both that for the young and for the old. That both need to understand there are things in life that they need to be prepared for, and things that youth and age bring to the fullness of life. They need to be side by side. And then the concluding words of wisdom about man's purpose in life. Fearing God and keeping His commandments being the point that is made there as he draws that to a close as the final word that is given by the writer Solomon. So that's what we're going to start with this evening, the Lord willing, in chapter 7. Anything there on the overview of that? Anybody got any points to make? All right, let's get into chapter 7. A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. Better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by a sad countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. That statement, a good name is better than precious ointment. Why? You have a comparison there that's being made. What's the comparison about that?
It doesn't stay long. It leaves. A good name is always there.
Okay. What else?
A good name is earned.
Okay.
You don't just get a good name. I mean, you have to work for it. And it takes years to get and 3 minutes to destroy,
Okay.
or less. One word can destroy your good name.
It's going to be of a lasting good. It's going to be something that's more than superficial. It's something that is greatly deserved after a long time and earned in that way. All of those things are so. Therefore, what takes longer to get? That good name or a good smell from the ointment? Good name. That I might put on the cologne in just a moment, or an ointment that is there, some oil that was fragrant, whatever it might be, and just for a little bit, it'll be gone after a little while. But that good name takes a long time. That takes a matter that is there for years to develop. And then, as I think it was Scott that you just said something about it's gone quickly if it's misspent. And certainly that is so. So what's the point? Here's something that we have a cosmetic value in, an ointment that is there. Whether that ointment is meant for smell or for some sort of a benefit or whatever, like an oil might be, I don't care. Whichever one, it's going to be passing. The other one is one that's a lasting matter, and it's something that takes a matter for us to look at for some period of time in getting to that. It takes a depth of preparation and so forth. So you're looking at these things. Now, the next thing, the day of death than the day of one's birth. You can get the precious ointment and the name, the good name. Then why is the very next thing the day of death than the day of one's birth? Why the day of death? I don't see too many people saying, boy, I'm looking forward to dying more than being born. Why is that day of death better? Go ahead, Mary.
Well, both the good name and the day of death are denoting wisdom.
Okay. When I have a day of death, what does that mean about my life? I've completed it, right? Day of birth is the day of starting it. When one starts, a baby that is there starts that life that is here on the earth. I'm not talking about that begins life. The life was begun at conception according to Scripture, but the living of that life on the earth. That's something that you've got all of that ahead of you. There's potential there. But the day of death, what you have is the fulfillment of that. Go ahead, Gerald.
Well, the influence, it's going to be lasting. Like we see that all the time. But people's gone on before us, and you talk about, and we talk about people that had influence in their lives and what meant so much. So that would be a lasting influence.
That's right. And you have this kind of point. In our lives, what we tend to do is focus on that which is more, I guess you would say, immediate. That which is gratifying at the moment. And yet what the wisdom writer here is trying to get us to understand is that really the true values come for a time. There's going to be something that we have to develop throughout life and work through, that it's not something that you can just get the things that are really valuable in life in just a second or in just a moment. It's going to take some time and development in that. That's going to require a wisdom that grows. Anything else there? Go ahead.
Well, I would say, I hope that most Christians have a good name and they're preparing for the day of death, which is the reward. You know, when we die is when we get our reward.
That's right. Our citizenship is in heaven. That's where we're going. Go ahead.
Could you also say that after our death, our life's more valuable to others because people usually reflect on that life?
Well, maybe in a lot of ways that may be so. I think some people remember them differently than I did. That I've gone to some funerals of real characters, and they were preached in such a way that, man, they were wonderful people. I wish I'd have known them in the way that guy did. But that's true, that you see a good life and you look back on it, and it has an influence in that way that you recognize more in hindsight than the present many times. Okay, When he goes on then and he says it's better to go to the house of mourning. All of this is building to try to get us to understand there's some things that aren't desirable, but they're best. And that even though they're less desirable than the alternative for the moment and gratifying, they're the thing that ultimately will make a better person out of us. Better to go to the house of mourning. I want you to notice that word better, because that's not the typical word that we get in the English language, better. Both there and sorrow is better than laughter. The sad countenance of the heart is made better. The word there doesn't have a comparative meaning. It really means well-pleasing, or that which is acceptable. And if you render it that way, it just has a little bit of difference, but that's the point from the original language, having to do with you're more accepted, or there's something well-pleasing about going to the house of mourning. It's not what you like, but it's going to cause that which is to be well-pleasing than going to the house of feasting. That's the end of all men, to be one who ends up in that house of mourning. What we usually call a house of mourning. All right, a funeral. To go to those kind of things cause us to think about that. Death is never a theoretical thing when you go to a funeral. It's a reality. You can't deny that fact. There was someone you knew that was living, now they're dead. And that end of this life is something that I'm to face. The living will take it to heart. What happens to me then? That's the thought that comes along there. The sorrow that accompanies that house of mourning is better than laughter. Why? By a sad countenance, the heart is made better in the sense of well-pleasing or acceptable. How's that so?
Brings about a sense of sobriety.
Okay. When we're going through it and having a party, everybody's happy, everything like that, is that a bad thing? No, that's already been pointed out in the book. That's a good thing that we would have that joyous occasion, that we would have those kind of times. But what is better in the sense of character about those sad times than those happy times?
You have more of a sense of self-reflection
Okay.
on where you really are in life.
There's no inward inspection that usually comes with a great deal of happiness. I mean, happiness comes from things that happen that are good, and we react to it in that way. It's a reaction. It's not a reflection. When you have the sadness that is there, that's a reflection about our character. What ought we to be? When someone would do something that causes us sadness, the reflection is about not only what has happened, why it's happened, what have I done like that maybe to someone else that I didn't realize that caused them this, or other things that are there when I'm involved in doing that which is ending up in a catastrophe or some problem. Then we look that over and we're caused to reflect and ask, did this have to be this way? Could I have done something that would have made a difference in this, that would have been a better way of life? Now, I can't do anything about that particular case in most times, that I've done something that is there that gets to an end that isn't so good. But what can I do in the future? I can avoid that problem in the future, maybe some wisdom. Maybe I can teach others to avoid it. And I can also reflect on whatever has been caused that's a problem. Maybe I need to correct that in some way, and in some way get that to be. Sadness humbles a person. That's what it does, ultimately. It causes an humbling of that one, because there's what is being gone through that isn't desirable. And having humbled one, then it sometimes makes us to be a better in character for a learning experience. Sherry, and then back up here.
It's also demonstrating or showing what he said before. There's one end to everybody, and we all die, and here it is.
me and mine, what makes me happy. But
Okay.
at this end, regardless, we're all gonna face it.
In that sense of the better getting at what's well-pleasing or what's approved, that's the point. It gets us towards that end of my, go ahead.
To me, this section is a contrast of thinking about spiritual things versus life under the sun. And it's so much better to focus on those things. Maybe sorrowful to focus on some of those things, but it makes us not so attached to life under the sun.
Exactly.
The warning here, it's a good mechanism to help you have some empathy too. You know, Jesus went to the Beatitudes, blessed those who are mourn, who will mourn.
They'll be comforted.
Be comforted. Well, the same thing, we're to comfort those who are around us who are mourning. So if you've been through that, you know it helps you be a little bit more empathetic towards other people. So it's a good mechanism, a tool to teach you things.
That's right. Okay. When you go on down from that, it says, the heart of the wise, therefore, is where? In the house of mourning. But the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. Does that mean that everybody who's involved in a party or happiness is a fool? No. It's talking about the point of the wisdom that is learned. If we recognize what's learned to be well-pleasing, to be acceptable, that changes character, that gets our values restored, we understand the need for being in those times of sadness or mourning, those difficulties of life, because they help us to prepare. They help us to be those who are more what we ought to be before God. Not just what we ought to be before God, though that is the main point, but also what we ought to be in service to others, because those will help us in that way more so than the other will. Neither one of them is by itself. Both of them are needed, but the balance needs to be looked at. When you look at the idea that there is gladness at the time and you're supposed to have that, remember that point. You don't come to a place like this and say, now I need to throw away all that gladness. No, that had been approved of before, but recognize the idea of values that are there. Something is more in priority than another. And with regard to, I guess you would say, the ratio of what you're into, there is something that is to be gained by those times of sadness and sorrow and mourning that is not gained the other way. That's why you see Jesus was a man of sorrows, acquainted with our grief. That's what he went through, because that's what was necessary for us. All right, anything else there? Go ahead, Sherry. That's all right.
A good name produces things that will go with you into eternity.
Yeah,
And riches will stay here on earth.
that's right.
So,
There's a difference that's pointed out there. Verse 5 through 7. It is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. For like the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. This also is vanity. Surely oppression destroys a wise man's reason, and a bribe debases the heart. That statement, it's better to hear the rebuke of the wise. Now, is that just saying to get rebuked is more fun than going out and hearing somebody with a song of festivity or whatever? No. What's good about the rebuke that is pointed out there? Who's it from? Does the rebuke of someone who's a fool help him? No. The point is, it's a rebuke of one who has that value of rebuke. Sometimes we think, well, I'm going to give a rebuke to someone because I didn't like what they did. Well, we need to step back and say, now, is there a wisdom in this? Or is this just my own idea? Is this something that is needed? When we have a correction that is necessary, if it's a needed correction, that's a good thing. And somebody benefits by that. But if it's correction that is merely our own idea or something that is unneeded, that doesn't make it to be so. The value is not in the rebuke. The value is in the wisdom that's there behind that rebuke. And that's the point that is being made. If I have that wisdom that is there and someone rebukes in a way that is going to help me gain that wisdom. I remember when I was starting out preaching, there were two older preachers who were there who would kind of give me a little thing, and it always was interesting to me. I'd go away and I'd figure out, hey, what they were telling me is I should have done it this way rather than this way. But it didn't really sound that way. It was a rebuke of wisdom, if you will, or correction, a way of getting me to think about things. And I gained a whole great deal from that. It was a great privilege to be able to be there. And they would give that sense, that wisdom that's found in there. You learn a great deal from that. That's kind of the experience that comes about in learning. What happens with the song of a fool? What do you gain? All right. Might have been funny, you know. Might have been worth a laugh for a moment, and it might have been just pure folly that isn't. I don't know. But the point is, here you contrast. Contrast is not the rebuke and the song itself. It's the rebuke of the wise, the song of the fool. There you have that comparison, and the one is better than the other. He said, like crackling of thorns under a pot. What happens when you put a thorn bush branch under or in a fire? Pop, 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 pop. Why? What do those thorns have? Air. Have a bunch of air that's there. Does that help your fire? Doesn't help it a bit. All it does starts causing sparks to happen and mess things up. Here you have this idea, the crackling of thorns under a pot. It's useless. It's something that causes a problem, really. So is the laughter of the fool. In other words, if we're just going to go out after laughter and be involved in jolliment from somebody who's an idiot, all we're going to do is prove our own likeness with that one. But what we need to understand is that's not really the place where there is a benefit. Surely oppression, excuse me, that's the one I meant to go to. This also is vanity. It's not that it's necessarily wrong, but it's empty. It's empty of any good that is being pointed out there. A lot of our life we need to think about in this term of the vanity of vanities, as it talks about. There are a lot of things that are not necessarily wrong, but they're useless. They're empty of any good. We may be involved in them and spend a great deal of time in them, and what value is it? When we're all through with it, it's done nothing. There's no productivity in it whatsoever. And that's the idea that's trying to be seen here. Look at your life and recognize you need to do something of value, not something that's just a matter of vanity to get from one minute to the next. Surely oppression destroys a wise man's reason. Why? Why does oppression do that? If I'm oppressing someone, what am I doing? Putting them under some captivity or some restraint, right? Does that allow them to be able to distribute or in some way make known the wisdom that they have? No, that oppression destroys the wise man's reason. In other words, it makes it of no effect. It captivates it, makes it unable to be heard. And a bribe does what? How does a bribe debase the heart? Whose heart does it debase? Do what?
The honest person.
Okay. So here we go, and this, let's say for a bribe on a jury or something. Here's someone that I bribed to do the opposite of what would be justice. A person on the jury is debased by that. But who else? The one who does the the wrong is debased. The one who gives the bribe is debased. In other words, there isn't the purpose of what is just and right. Bribery, or the buying off of things that would not or should not be so, causes something to be made worse. And in doing that, what it does is it suppresses that recognition of what's right, what's true. Let's say I bought off a jury and somebody who's out there guilty of murder now gets off. Now, I've not only caused that murderer to think he can get by with murder because he just has. Now, I've not only debased the juror that I bought off so that the person could get off of that to where it's caused a contortion of justice. Well, what happens to the society around it? If you have corruption, a whole society is debased because it's no longer reason and right and justice that is the concern. It's who has the most money. And the result of that is not going to be given to a upholding and exalting of reason. Anybody else got anything there? That idea of bribery or corruption, that's been going on as long as the world has been going on. It's not something that takes place in some culture over the seas or in our culture alone. It takes place everywhere, and the more it gets embedded, not only does it debase people, it debases the whole society. It's a bad for the society in the sense of the best coming out. It's no longer based on what's productive and right and true and valued. It's based on whatever is there of power and wealth, and that's it. And so his point is we need to go back to that reason being the basis of it. Verse 8 then through verse 10. The end of a thing is better than its beginning. The patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Do not hasten in your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools. Do not say, why were the former days better than these? For you do not inquire wisely concerning this. All right. The end of a thing being better. Why is the end of a thing better than its beginning, typically? Okay. Same reason that the day of death is better than the day of birth, in the sense that you're done with it. You've gone through. You have that finishing of that task that is there. So you reach that end. Have you ever known people who start out lots of projects and don't finish any? Anybody want to plead guilty with me? What does it help you to get started? I've had some of the best gardens started that you've ever seen in your life. They were absolutely beautiful. But very few of them have gotten down to the end and be very good. Why? Because I didn't stay with it through the whole thing.
You lose interest.
Do what?
You lose interest.
All right. Lose interest. Also hate the work. Be honest about it in some of those things. Other things like that you recognize that it's difficult. There's a difficulty in staying with something. But when we do that, what benefit does it produce when we stay with something to the end?
You get a sense of pride.
All right. There's an accomplishment that is there. I've told people a number of times, I like one-day jobs. Those are great because you do a one-day job and you get started, you get finished, and you say, man, that's great. And that's a wonderful thing. There are very few things in preaching that are one-day jobs. I mean, and most other jobs, you have to do that over a long period of time. And so the sense of it is we just kind of let off, slack off, and we do not get the accomplishments at the end of the point. That's not good for us. That's not good for the project or whatever else is there. We need to recognize we need to keep on pressing to that end. Where does that ultimately have a good application? All right, the spiritual things of in our life, to go on to the end, to be there who, the one who hears, well done, good and faithful servant. The patient in spirit Look at the words there. The patient in spirit is contrasted with who? The proud in spirit. Why? What's the contrast between the one who's patient and the one who's proud? Patience, the one who's got the long suffering, the stick-to-itiveness, right? How does that differ from pride? It's not the typical antonym we think of for patient. How are those two set in opposite places? What causes one to not be patient? What do they do instead of being patient and seeing it through to the end? What they want to do? There's a self-centeredness, a lack of self-denial or self-control that is there. And as a result of that, they don't see something through and stick with it until the end. So the point is, you have those two contrasts. Not an exact contrast of what we'd think of opposites, but it's what keeps me from getting to the end of that patience, to have that pride and that self-centeredness, that kind of arrogance that does what I want to do and doesn't care about other things. Now, how about the one who's hasty? This is the second time we've seen this. Do not hasten in your spirit to be angry. What does that mean, hasten to be angry? All right, quick-tempered. He flies off the handle quickly, we say sometimes. Why? All right, there's a lack of self-control. Ultimately, why does that anger have that flash like that? Okay. I don't like this. It causes me some pain or whatever else, and as a result, I'm going to snap out against that. What would stop that anger from being rash and quick? Do what?
Patience.
Okay.
You know, you go back to Proverbs, says, slow to wrath, but the quick temper man does not do the work of God.
Okay.
Very seldom, if ever, has a quick temper brought a nice result. When you look at yourself, and we usually get upset because things that go our way, and we realize our way is really not that big of a deal. And that is, you put other people first, and you step back out of it, then you're more patient and apt to behave as God would have you behave.
It's a heart issue.
Go ahead.
It's a heart issue.
A heart issue, okay. When I'm angry, let's say I'm hearing someone and what they're saying just makes my blood boil. How can I put a lid on that? How can I reverse that?
Fix it earlier.
Do what?
How to be prepared.
Okay.
Because when it comes to anger, a lot of it is kind of a build up, and then it explodes on something that might be later caused it.
When somebody blows up, is it typically after someone has finished a full explanation of what they've got? Very rarely. When is it? Ever find yourself, all of us do, I think, at times, where somebody is saying something, and in our mind, we're not listening to them, we're thinking what we're going to answer them. And I know where they're headed, because I've heard this before. And then they hit the trigger word or whatever else is there, and bang. Sometimes it's good to back off from that. But wait a minute. I want to hear this out. I want to hear what they have to say. There are several reasons for that. Sometimes they are headed where you think they're headed. But you hadn't let them get out there and show that very clear enough. And as a result of it, it's not going to be something that is easily turned around when they see the end of that. Sometimes they're not headed there. And if they've got another tack, I need to listen to that. But it's always good to listen to why someone believes something. One of the things that I've tried to do in having home studies with people, especially those who are non-Christians is go, and in the first class I do very little talking. I ask them questions about what their religious background is, what kind of experiences do you believe you're saved, what happened, can you tell me your story, all of these kind of things. I want them to say what they've got to say. Because a lot of times what happens is people will then hear in a class and they'll learn what the gospel is and they'll revert and think, yeah, that's what I did. Well, they didn't. They're not meaning to lie about it. That's just a process by which we sometimes get ourselves to say, well, yeah, I look at that, that must be what I did. Well, if you've got that up front, what that person has done and what their thoughts were then, it's not trying to trick them, it's simply trying to say, okay, let's deal with things in an objective way. Let's look and see what has been their religious background, what has been the thought, and then go from that point. In other ways, that is helpful to hear someone out in the way that they're going to do things. A lot of times I've found out that in pure matters of wisdom and matters of moral, right and wrong, there's one way that's right. But in some kind of cases of wisdom or judgment, there may be 2 or 3 or 4 different ways of going at something. And we might need to listen to that to learn how it might be better to do this in this situation or that in another situation. That comes with hearing things out, of having that experience. Whatever it does, what tends to happen is time tends to cause the anger to go down. Sometimes it boils it up. I know that if it keeps on that pressure. But that's not normal. The normal sense is the longer we bear with that and bite that tongue, the more we're going to be able to control it rather than the less we're going to be able to control it. And that's why haste is often put together with the folly of uncontrolled anger. Do you have something, Tom?
Yeah, do you think in this context it's talking about, and I know you haven't gone to verse 10 yet, but the bitterness that people have so often with the way things used to be and how angry that makes some people about how it was when they were kids or, whatever. They look back on these times and say, those were the good days, instead of realizing that there's this cycle of life that continues, and even though certain things may change, the grand scheme of things, it's always the same. Because you see a lot of people, and sometimes older people, that they kind of have, and this is just my personal experience, they kind of go one of 2 ways as they get older. And sometimes they become very bitter about life and the things that they've had to endure or whatever. And then others that have maybe were maybe a little more hard during their life have become kinder and more compassionate, more thoughtful of other people than they were even when they were younger, because they see life for what it is, that this cycle. Do you think that that has to do more with this anger of, this resting, constant bitterness?
I think that's part of it. The whole here is a principle, and there's going to be that application. I'm glad you made that point, because you've got an application made about age and what brings the problems one way or another. There's 2 different ways that you shift, and we're going to get to that in just a minute. But I'm glad you made that connection that was there. The idea of the sudden rashness that's there tends to go towards anger and tends to go towards that which is controlled. Anger rests in the bosom of fools. In other words, it's sitting there. It's a fire ready to get started. Now, he says, do not say, here's one of those, like Tyler was saying, here's an application of that. What if I'm all the time saying, oh, I like it back when I was growing up. It was like this. Now, is that inherently wrong? To say that some things were good back in the time when I was growing up. No, there's some things that are inherently a problem that develop through time. You look at Israelite history and you see through time, sometimes they became more those who are idolaters, those who are involved in the sexual sins, various things that are there. And to say back when so-and-so was king, this wasn't seen in the land, is not necessarily a bad thing. That's something that's pointed out by those who are the prophets as well. But what is the problem? If all I look at is the past and say, it was better back then, what am I not living in? The present with how you get to that right way. We go through those times in life. The idea of simply being bitter because we're not in the kind of things I like to be in. I look at this world and I say, yeah, during this time I don't see much more messed up than what I've seen in my whole life is, pretty much the top time. Now, what do I say? Well, I'm going to get mad. I'm going to throw up my hands. I'm going to just refuse to go away from it. No. Speak up with what's right. Recognize where you are. In the New Testament times, let me ask you this. Were they living in the perfect moral climate that you would think of righteousness to help everybody come more towards the principles of the gospel? If anything, you talk about the first century, an ungodly time, the likes of which even today you don't have going on. It was unbelievably horrible in a moral sense then. Now, what did that present? Paul talks about in the fullness of time, God sent forth his Son. Why did he pick that time of almost unparalleled ungodliness to send the gospel into the world? Because the contrast was so stark. Instead of thinking, oh, woe is me, this is all going downhill in our country, look on the other side of that. There's a whole lot of people out there who need salvation. There's a whole lot of people out there who've never heard the simple gospel of Christ. They've been polluted by the things of the world and the evils of the world and the pollutions of the false doctrines that are out there that compromise with the world. It's one thing to say things are bad. It's another thing to just say, throw up your hands, forget it. No. Look for the way to help in that time. When people get older, they do one of two things in a wrong direction. I'm not saying that the most people do this. I'm just saying if they're going to go a wrong direction, it's one or the other. The one is to get bitter, throw up their hands, and say, I don't like life, try to check out. The other is to compromise with everything and become so accommodating that they don't see the problems anymore. And I've seen both things with life. And I'll tell you what, I've experienced in my life the desire for both of those. I didn't ever think that I would get to a point to where I would be tending to be more accepting and more tolerant of all kinds of stuff, but I've felt that sense. As you get older, you get tired. You don't want to fight. And the effect of that is sometimes you take that too far and you compromise. And I've seen people do that. I've seen some of my own colleagues do that in the faith. But what you've got to do is say what's right. Let the will of God dictate what is right. Don't get mad about the situation. It's unredeemable, anything. Set your heart and say, okay, whatever it is in this life, I'm going to keep doing what's right. I'm going to try to keep doing what is the will of God. And I'm going to try to use my influence anywhere I can and my talents to try and spread the gospel and bring salvation to people. That's where you learn wisdom, is by controlling those things. If you just look at it and say, better back when I was younger, it doesn't do a whole lot of good. In fact, it doesn't do much of any good. It's something where we've got to learn to put those things into effect. All right, anybody got anything else there? Go ahead.
Tommy, when you look back sometimes, you think, oh, hey, I had no worries back then, or I had no cares back then. Well, look back and evaluate your relationship with God back then. How was it? Why didn't you have worries?
That's all we've got to live and do with it what God wants us to. I don't want to get started in the next part. I thought I wouldn't get all the way through, but verse 10, really? Okay. But we'll start there with verse 11 next time. Hopefully we can finish through Ecclesiastes chapter 7 then. Appreciate it.